Welcome.
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 Welcome to the unlikely
Seminarian.
Welcome to the Unlikely Seminarian.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unlikely Seminarian podcast. I am your host, Dan Cook, and thank you, as always, for taking the time to listen. Quick apology for it being so long in between episodes. A number of factors sort of conspired against me to delay me in bringing you another episode of the Unlikely Seminarian podcast. I won't go into all of them too terribly deeply, but there was a period of time in school where I was busy, followed by a break where I just needed to take a break. And then some other factors in life and in my church community and in a number of different areas sort of conspired to keep me away from the microphone for a little while. But I'm back, and we'll be cranking out a few episodes here, and hopefully with a bit more of a regular schedule. So I thank you for your patience, and I thank you again for taking the time to listen. Today we're going to start a series, and again, as I like to do, I don't know how many episodes this is going to take to finish, so we'll find out as we go along. But I want to start a quick series on what's called the problem of evil. For those of you that have visited the website recently, by recently I mean over the last month or so, you may have seen a blog post that gave a link to my latest sermon, which was, I believe, the first weekend in October. That sermon was based off of a chunk of the second chapter of the book of Job, and actually a verse from the first chapter as well, and talked about evil, and specifically the evil of Satan, and our relationship with God in the presence of evil, and how these things are all kind of intertwined. So if you have 20 minutes or so, and you want to go back, again, go to the unlikelyseminarian.com, click on blog in the upper right-hand corner, and that will take you to a post where there's a link to the podcast from my church, Genesis Covenant Church in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. We'll have the sermon there, and you're welcome to listen to that. I will thumbnail sketch as part of this series kind of the highlights of that sermon, and then we're going to dig a little deeper actually into the book of Job upon which that sermon is based. So at the outset, let's just talk a little bit about what the problem of evil is, or how it's defined in terms of a Christian context. And essentially it goes like this, and it tends to be, incidentally, probably the number one objection used by people who aren't Christians to explain why they're not Christians. It's a very effective argument. It's a fairly simple and understandable argument, and it's one that requires a lot of work, I think, to dig past to get to the reason why Christians are able to handle what is the seeming problem of evil. So dancing around all of that, let me try to define it very quickly for you. The problem of evil goes like this. There is evil in the world. Of course, we see that all the time. There are people who die of unnatural causes. There are people who are killed, hurt, maimed, raped. There's all kinds of evil in the world. You don't have to look very far. You can turn on the evening news for less than 5 minutes and see multiple examples of evil. For those of you who know me or know of me, I work in the news radio industry, and every single day we talk about examples of evil. It's just literally a part of life, and it's actually a struggle not to become numb to that sort of thing when you're literally swimming in that water 8 hours of your everyday life. So the problem of evil goes like this. If there's evil in the world, we know that exists, we accept that, then we have a problem. Because if, as the Judeo-Christian ethic affirms, God is all good and God is all powerful, then how do we account for the presence of evil? If God is all good and all powerful, should he not be able to eradicate all forms of evil from the face of the earth? Or is God able to eradicate it and chooses not to, in which case he would seem to be not all good? Or is God desirous of eradicating evil from the face of the earth and is unable to, in which case he would not be all powerful? That seems to be an awfully tricky corner from which to extricate oneself if one's going to accept the Judeo-Christian ethic of God being all good and all powerful and accept that there is evil in the world. It seems like a bit of a difficult spot to get oneself out of, and it's why it's so understandable. It's why so many people cite this problem as the number one reason why they choose not to believe in God. It's entirely understandable if you accept that binary, and therein sort of lies the rub. You have to accept the binary that God either could eradicate all evil from the face of the earth and chooses not to, or that God would like to eradicate all evil from the face of the earth, but can't. And what I'm suggesting, we'll get to in all of this, is I believe that there's a third way. But I do want to, make sure we affirm that I understand how people get to that binary, and I understand how people live there and say, he's either not all good or he's not all powerful. Either way, this God that you affirm as a person of a Judeo-Christian background can't possibly exist. It's philosophically impossible. I understand how people get there. I just reject the binary. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. And I want to get there by first, like I said, starting with the thumbnail sketch of the sermon that I gave. Because I think the one thing that binary assumes in error is that God is solely responsible for everything that happens on earth. That he's the only being acting on earth. That there are no other beings acting on earth. And that no other beings are responsible for anything that happens on earth. And I think that's the logical fallacy that blows apart the problem of evil. The first thing I want to talk about is, again, kind of based off the sermon that I gave, and it's off the first couple of chapters of the book of Job. And really, the one passage that I'll read sort of sets up what I want to talk about a little bit, which is going to be from Job chapter 2. And we start even with verse 1 of chapter 2. This is the NRSV reading of this, by the way. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. Job chapter 2, verse 1. The heavenly beings in this case are assumed to be angels, and Satan shows up. And as we go through that first couple of chapters, you see Satan challenging Job's faithfulness and telling God that if God didn't give Job everything Job wanted, if God hadn't blessed Job to that degree, that Job wouldn't have faith in God. Satan is a Hebrew word which translates loosely to the accuser. Satan accuses Job of being a fraud and challenges God to afflict Job in such a way that Satan believes Job will be borne out to be a fraud, will be proven to be a fraud. God doesn't act towards Job. God allows Satan to act towards Job. And a bunch of really, really bad stuff happens to Job, and Job doesn't turn around and curse God. To which God points and says, see, my guy Job, he gets it. You can do all this bad stuff to him. He still knows that I'm in it with him. I'm not sure that's 100% the case. I'm not sure Job really did know that God was in it with him. And I think we find that out throughout the rest of the book of Job, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. But I think the thing to understand here is that God is not the one acting towards Job. It is Satan who's acting towards Job. And I think that's where we sort of have to pull back a little bit and see that there's a bigger picture here. That God has created a world in which there are agents with agency. Those agents most easily are defined as human beings. We see other human beings all around us acting in ways that are less than good, that are in fact evil. You could also argue, based on biblical text, that there are agents above and beyond human beings acting in the world. Satan obviously being one of those and being made perhaps chief amongst those. But you hear phrases like from Paul, principalities and powers. There are mentions of demons. There are mentions of spirits. There are mentions of all kinds of spiritual beings for which there's very, very little knowledge, quote unquote, put in the Bible. We don't know a lot about the spiritual realm other than it's assumed in the Bible to exist. Can we assume it to exist? Well, if you are willing to accept that there is a God, if you are willing to accept that there are such things as angels, as positive spiritual beings, then it would sort of logically assume that there could be the inverse or the negative of those beings. So it's certainly possible, it's certainly plausible that there could be spiritual. And I know that this is where we get a real oogie-boogie when it comes to Christianity and to faith, and matters of faith. And I know there's a lot of people who listen to this podcast who aren't people of faith and who are very tempted to tune out right now. And I totally get that. I am with you and I am for you, and I hope you'll hang in there. Because I understand how people wrestle with notions of spiritual beings. I get it. I totally, totally do. I'll just tell you my opinion is that I believe that spiritual beings exist on some level. I believe we know very little about them, but I believe that they exist. And I believe, based mostly on that little voice that's in your head from time to time, that tells you you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not attractive enough, you're not worthy of being loved. Why would anybody want to hear what you have? That kind of voice, we've all heard it. I don't believe that voice is intrinsic to us, and the reason I don't believe it's intrinsic to us is that if you look at small children, you don't see the kind of symptoms of that voice existing. I don't think that we're born with it. I think it comes from somewhere outside of us. And while I can't prove to you in any kind of scientific fashion that that comes from some sort of spiritual evil forces, to me that makes as logical a sense as any other possible explanation. So I choose to put my faith in what the Bible says about spiritual beings and about those kinds of forces. I choose to believe that when the Hebrew word Satan is attached to this evil being, that his accusatory status makes him a very, very logical source for that voice that we hear. And so I think there are sources outside of God that create evil in the world. So while God desires good for his creation, there is evil that exists within it that isn't from him, of which he's not the source, I guess is the way to say it. Which leads us to the other question. Okay, if God desires good, and there are agents within his creation that are doing evil, why doesn't he just stop them? It's a fair question, and it's one we're going to take a run at in the very next episode. I hope you'll join me. Until then, this is Dan Cook, and you've been listening to The Unlikely Seminarian.